Let's get back to the editors. You can add as many modules as you need into the grid and it will connect them automatically. Let me add a few modules to various lanes. Clicking on one shows its editor, and I can also drag it anywhere. So let me do that, and look how the engine reconnects things every time I move it. As mentioned before, there are a few handy shortcuts. Alt and click deletes a module. Control, or Command on Mac and click, toggles bypass. Shift and click shows it in a pop-up window. And double-clicking on a module disables it, so the engine will behave like it's not there at all. Next, you can right-click on the module, which displays additional properties. These may be different depending on each module, so let's see about the volume and panorama module, which is one of the simplest ones. First, there's the input panel, which controls where this module gets the input from. By default, it's auto, which means the same lane the module is on. But let me change it. The steel input switch tells the engine nobody else can take audio from that reverb anymore. See what happens? The modules below were connected to the reverb, but there's no audio anymore, so the engine disables them. If there would be no modules, the signal wouldn't even pass to the output. Generate feedback panel is a bit harder to think about. You can already see that the signal always flows down, but feedback lets you send something back up as well. Choose a channel no other module is generating, and then insert a module called feedback, which will extract the feedback signal. Note that this may require a considerable amount of CPU power if the feedback's delay is too small. Notes panel just lets you write some notes for yourself if you need that. And there's a rename button in the bottom, which lets you change the name of the module itself. This is especially useful for complex scenarios, and note that this name will actually be used by the engine itself to connect multi-parameters, modulators, and other subsystems to the parameters of your modules, so you should do it sooner rather than later. Banks panel lets you save multiple snapshots of that module's settings and switch between them using a multi-parameter, for example. Note that this is a very advanced thing to do, and since the modules may store complex settings such as wavetables, graphs of some sort, etc., the engine needs to bypass that module while loading the settings, so it is definitely not a good idea to automate or modulate such a thing. From the buttons in the bottom, copy definitely requires some explaining. It copies the settings of the module as you'd expect, but it also copies everything else, including which module it is. So let me click it. And now I click an empty slot, and there's a button in here letting me paste, create the volume and panorama module. There are a few more important switches in the title of the module settings. Enable is pretty obvious and does the same thing as double-clicking the module as I already talked about. Solo enables or disables all other modules. Mute silences any output of this module. But Smart Bypass is a bit more complicated, nevertheless important. When disabled and you toggle Module Bypass, you may hear a click because the module suddenly stops working. What's even worse, if you unbypass a reverb, for instance, you will suddenly hear the tail from a different signal, the one it was processing before. The solution is the Smart Bypass, which keeps the module running all the time, and whenever the bypass is toggled, the engine will create a short crossfade. That sounds great and lets you even modulate the bypass without artifacts. But there's a drawback. The module needs to run even if bypassed. So it's up to you if the artifact-free bypass is more important than CPU usage. So far we've been talking about a simple module with just one input and one output. But things can be way more complex. So let's first check Ratio, a cool module for blending two signals. Click an empty slot and start by typing RAT, just to speed up searching. It has two inputs, but connected to the same lane though. So right-click and there's one more panel we didn't see yet, Sidechain, and it works the same way the input panel does. There are modules with even more inputs. Try Ratio by input. It blends between two signals and follows the third one being the desired ratio. As usual, right-click it, and now there are two sidechain panels. And there are modules with variable number of inputs, such as the mixer. And in the settings, there is just one panel, Inputs, where you enable all inputs it should take and steal. Next, there are modules with multiple outputs. Ratio Splitter, for example, has two outputs, and there's nothing to set up in the module settings really. But with the crossover module, there is. The number of outputs, which in turn defines the number of crossover bands. Finally, there are modules which can follow MIDI input, such as the MSoundFactory itself, which also doesn't have any input whatsoever. So what is there in the plugin settings? First, there's the MIDI input panel, which controls which MIDI channel it should follow and note range. By default, it follows all notes on all channels. And then there's the Note on Triggering panel, which may explain why on earth you would need MSoundFactory inside MSoundFactory in the first place. The plugin itself is always triggered by notes. But what if you want something to be triggered by releasing a MIDI key, for instance, such as some percussive sound of a piano key being released? Then you can do what I'm doing now. Disable Note On and enable Note Off triggering. This panel has several other options and is likely it will have more in the future. All of them define how and what kinds of notes are triggering this module. Okay, that's just about all the wisdom I can provide about the FX tab. Let's switch to the Generator tab. Things are nearly identical in there, but each module has a MIDI filter panel. That one lets you ignore some modules for voices, which don't meet the criteria, such as a minimal velocity, for example. There's one more cool thing I didn't show you. So what if you run out of space in the grid? I told you you can have as many modules as you need, right? Yes, you can. Check the Modular section in the module list. Just insert Modular, for instance, and you have a brand new playground for any dirty sound design fantasy.